In this lecture, we're looking at Anselm and his argument for the existence of God. And in our last lecture, we were discussing how the lives of Lanfranc of Bec and Anselm were intertwined. We discussed how there was this methodological dispute over the proper use of reason over against authority in the 11th century of the Church. Well, the lives of Lanfranc and Anselm were really intertwined all the way until the end of Anselm's life. In fact, in terms of church appointment, the two hold two of the most significant posts within the Northern European Church during this time. It was in 1060 that Anselm becomes a monk there at the Abbey of Bec. Well, just 3 years later, Lanfranc is moved and he takes up a post elsewhere. And it was at this point that Anselm himself becomes prior there in the Abbey of Bec. The parallels don't really stop there, though. Lanfranc will eventually go on to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Again, one of the more important posts in all of Northern Europe. He would then die in 1089, and after about 4 years, when the king, William Rufus, let the post lay open and took the money for himself, finally in 1093, Anselm himself is appointed as the successor to Lanfranc as the Archbishop of Canterbury. In many ways, the parallel of their life is really vital because it at least serves as an analogy to the way in which their approach to theology was so very similar. In our last lecture, of course, we talked about how, on the one hand, you had the rationalists, those who believed that if there was a tension or a conflict between authority and the use of reason, they believed that reason was going to win out. And on the other hand, there were those who believed that if this same conflict was present, that the issue of authority was so great, be it scriptural authority or the church's authority, that it would eventually lead to really the cessation of reason as the guiding principle for resolving the conflict. And we said that Lanfranc was somewhere in between, that he believed, and he taught, that faith and reason were locked in a dialectical relationship. The two worked simultaneously to resolve conflict in theology and to bring problems to a conclusion. Well, Anselm comes from this exact same position. Anselm, in many ways, becomes the real codifier of the basis of this perspective. He believes that there is a dialectic that is based first and foremost on faith, on the revelation of God in the Scriptures, and in a manner of speaking, only those who have eyes to see and ears to hear are going to be able to approach the problem of theological issues from the context of faith, which is received on authority. Still, Anselm, like Lanfranc, believed that God has given us minds to think, and that when exercised properly within their own jurisdictions and within their own bounds, our minds can and should attempt to reason within the context of this faith. Well, what we're going to look at now is Anselm's argument for the existence of God. It's sometimes known as the ontological argument for the existence of God. And we need to say right now, Anselm's argument here is both loved and hated, depending on the philosopher, depending on the generation of those who hear it. In 1720, the Pope at the time declared Anselm to be a doctor of the Church. Now, a doctor of the Church is a very specific title that's not given out very often, and it's only given to those whose teachings are considered to be both healthy and part of the establishment of the Catholic Church itself. And so within the Catholic Church, Anselm is highly regarded and considered one of the doctors. Within Protestant circles, Anselm has had highs and lows, again, depending on those who find his arguments to be compelling. Well, what were his arguments? How did they come about? Well, as Anselm took over the priory there in Bec, he was appointed at a very young age. And he was appointed at such a young age because his learning and his ability to deal with rich and deep philosophical issues set him apart from those who were around him. In other words, Anselm is not a latecomer to the success of his intellectual disciplines. He is put forward at a very young age. And as the story goes, as his first biographer tells us, Anselm's teachings on the existence of God or on theology itself were so well regarded by those at Bec that he began to get something of a name for himself even outside of the abbey. And, at least Anselm tells us, it was at the behest of his students that he began to write some of his arguments down. Now, on the issue of philosophy and on the proof of God's existence, Anselm actually wrote 2 books. And the presence of both of these books signals something of a mania within Anselm. Anselm tells us that he spent the majority of his life seeking a single argument for God's existence. He wanted a comprehensive theory or a comprehensive argument that put to rest the question of, can our minds reason their way to God on the context of their own authority or on their own reasoning? And we're going to say something about what Anselm was trying to do here in a minute. But he wrote 2 books. The first was the Monologion. And the Monologion was, again, his first attempt. Anselm wrote down his arguments for God's existence. He completed it. He was joyous and happy about it. And then it all seemed to unravel. Anselm found himself immediately working on another book, on a second book. The Monologion, he felt, was simply insufficient as an argument for God's existence. What he eventually came up with, though, in 1078, when he published the Proslogion, the follow-up to the Monologion, is Anselm finally came to a conclusion of an argument that he believed was the definitive proof for the establishment of a rational basis for God's existence. So in 1078, the Proslogion is published, and Anselm would go on thereafter to be hailed as one of the first great philosophical theologians in the course of Western history. Now, a few things need to be said about this book and about what Anselm believes he's doing before we actually get into this argument. First and foremost, it needs to be pointed out immediately, what Anselm is doing when he's arguing for the existence of God is he is not approaching the argument in the way that modern apologists approach the subject. He is not attempting to come up with an argument for God's existence, reasoning, as it were, from atheism into theism or into tritheism or the Trinitarian doctrines. He is not beginning with the assumption that he has no faith and that he does not believe in God. The fact that this escapes people so very often is really troubling for historians. The book itself, the Proslogion, is actually written as a prayer. The whole thing begins with this opening paragraph that calls for the reader, actually in this case it's Anselm himself, he's referring to himself really in the third person, but he calls on himself to slow down, to rest in God, and to think about Him, something of the life of leisure sought by all these intellectuals in the Middle Ages. The entire book, in fact, is based on Psalm 52, where it says that the fool says in his heart that there is no God. And Anselm, therefore, is basing everything he's going to say, all the arguments for the existence of God, on this idea that from Scripture, from the context of faith, he reads that the fool says there is no God. And he kind of flips that verse on its head and he says, well, I don't want to be a fool. I am a man of faith. And the entire context of my life, therefore, is to work out and to meditate upon the very existence of God. The book itself, within Anselm's day, actually was better known by the phrase faith-seeking understanding. The red thread, in other words, that runs throughout the entirety of the book is that Anselm believes that he, as a man of faith, basing his idea off of Psalm 52, is going to then attempt to not be a fool and argue and debate and think and ponder and all of these wonderful things, he thinks, about the existence of God. So it's very important that you understand that the Proslogion, again, is not meant to be an apologetics work in and of itself. Rather, the entire focus of it is to strengthen the faith of the one who already has it. And this reality is actually signaled by the fact that the book is not simply an argument for God's existence. The other focal point of this book is a long meditative reflection on what we call the attributes of God. Questions about His goodness, justice, mercy, God's aseity, and so on and so forth. So again, Anselm was doing something different here than simply trying to reason his way to God, having kicked the ladder of faith away. Rather, he sees himself as sitting within the context of faith, and he wants to reckon with God with his mind. Well, the argument that Anselm comes up with, in fact, at least by and large, we think this is the first such argument of this kind for the existence of God. This argument is often referred to as the, quote, ontological argument for the existence of God. Now, when I was a philosophy student, I always got annoyed when the professor would not stop and define what all this jargon meant. So we're going to do that first before we actually get into Anselm's argument. What were the vocabularies in the context of the world he was dealing with? Well, an ontological argument, in this case, is something of a misnomer. When we talk about ontology, what we often mean is what is the being of something? What is its essence? Ontos in Greek just means being or essence, of course. We're arguing not about what its accidental properties are, but rather what it means to be the very thing that we're talking about. Just to put some concrete examples under this, if I were to talk about what it means to be human, that in and of itself has the question of ontology built into it. What does it mean to be something? What does it mean to be this human, this person? Now, if I were going to be talking about the accidental properties, as they're called, it would be discussing things like what does it mean to be a tall man or a short man? Tall and short are accidental. That is to say, one could be a human whether or not you're tall or short. You can be either or. Accidental properties, in other words, are the things that we consider to be non-essential to what it means to be something. So when Anselm was talking about the existence of God, and we'd call this the ontological argument, what he's arguing about is who is God in and of himself. Now, what's going on here in Anselm's mind is he is applying, roughly speaking, a Platonic perspective on the theory of knowledge. Perhaps you'll recall from our lecture on Plato that he had a conception of knowledge in which all the things we see around us in this world are not the essence or the reality of things in and of themselves. When we come across a chair or we come across a person, when we come across specific things, Plato argued that the reason we can recognize one thing as being a chair and then next to it we can see an entirely different chair, different shape, different fabric, different material, different color, different everything, and yet we still call them both chair. For Plato, that was almost mystical because for him, there was out there in the world of being, out in something he called the world of forms, some great concept of chair itself. And so for Plato, we don't have to really go up and do experiments on individual chairs to come to the conclusion that they're chairs. We just simply recognize them. Because we have some mystical insight, some connection to this world of the forms, we recognize chair when we see it. Now that Platonic move is going to come home to roost here in Anselm. Because Anselm is going to talk about God's being in a more Platonic way. That is to say, he's going to use what we call a priori concepts. Now let's define this again. A priori, the really easiest way to remember this, is it functions like a geometric proof, or it functions in another math analogy, the way we know what a triangle is. If I were to say, what is a triangle? Well, the definition of a triangle is something with three sides. You don't have to get up and go figure out what a triangle is. If you know that the definition of a triangle is something with three sides, then you'll recognize it anytime you see it. You don't have to be a scientist, in other words, to go figure out what a triangle is. Someone says a triangle is something with three sides. When do you recognize then a triangle? Well, I recognize it because it has three sides. In other words, a priori arguments reason from basic principles to something else. It doesn't go from experiment or experience or us testing something and then coming to a conclusion after we experiment or test it. Again, in my mind, this idea of geometry works best. I don't know about you, but having to memorize all those theorems, all those principles of geometry that you then apply every time you come across a problem in math always used to irk me. But what were we doing? Well, we were memorizing the a priori, or the definitions, the foundational principles of geometry. Then if you go measure things, you can figure out what the answer is based off of those principles. Well, what Anselm is going to do with his arguments for the existence of God is he's going to apply this Platonic backdrop, this Platonic foundation, you might say, with this concept of a priori knowledge to the question of does God exist? So if you find this argument that he makes weird, you have to understand what he thinks he's doing. So often in the modern world, we don't really reason this way in terms of our philosophical knowledge. The sciences have programmed us all to believe that the way you know something is you experience it, you test it, you measure it. Now, in the sciences, they don't believe only that you know things from sensory experience. But too often what ends up happening is people believe, well, if you want to know who God is, you have to talk about how you've experienced him only. There is a lack of privilege in the modern world, in other words, at least in modern evangelicalism or Protestantism, with these kinds of a priori arguments. In Anselm's day, these are perfectly fine arguments. Now, as we'll see in a minute, not everyone accepts them even in Anselm's own day. So if in the end, when I finish describing what Anselm has to say about the ontological argument, if you ultimately find the argument inconclusive or problematic, you wouldn't be the first. That's okay. It's not because you're stupid that you don't get this, but rather in the historical framework, you got to put yourself within the mind of Anselm to figure out what he thinks he's doing before you reject possibly what it is he has done. Okay, so we have the Platonic idea here, this idea that there are things outside of our minds that are more true than the things in our minds. And we have the Platonic idea that the things we experience in this world are but half-remembered concepts of the very true thing out there in the world of the forms. Now, Anselm was not a full Platonist, but these are more or less the conclusions that he has derived from his Platonic perspective on things. So you have those two principles from Platonism. Then within this, he has this, again, a priori desire to prove God's existence. Again, much in the same way that we would talk about a triangle being simply three sides, and you don't need to measure a triangle to figure out if that definition is true. The definition precludes that it already is true, whether you measure it or not. So when Anselm comes to the question, does God exist? And he begins with Psalm 52, and this idea that the fool says in his heart that there is no God. Anselm's basic argument is going to drive these three concepts together. And the slogan, you might call it, that Anselm comes up with for God's existence is that God is, quote, that than which nothing greater can be thought. And what Anselm does is he starts to reflect on the idea that in our minds we have this idea that there is God and that he is great. Now, the argument that he puts forward is, if God only exists in the mind, and if the definition of God is that he is that than which nothing greater could be thought, then he has to actually exist outside of the mind as well. Now, this is usually when people sort of go cross-eyed. They feel as if he's made some logical jump here. So he says we begin with this idea that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, and then he goes, well, if it's in your mind, it's got to be in existence outside of the mind as well. Well, that would be crazy, again, if you don't bring into bear the Platonic ideas here, and again, the more triangle argument, if you want to call it that. Just as a triangle is in our mind, the thing that has three sides, but a triangle doesn't exist only in our minds. Rather, the definition of it exists in our minds, but the reality of what it is to be a triangle is not simply located in our mind. Even if I want to believe that a triangle does not have three sides, well, the definition of a triangle is something of three sides. So I can't even change the categories because, again, a priori, the definition of a triangle is something with three sides. That's really what Anselm is saying here. Our definition of God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. From the context of faith, we know that God is supreme. He is the great one. He is the omnipotent one. There is nothing greater than God, put it that way. Well, what Anselm then decides, he concludes, is that this can't simply exist in our mind because the very definition of it is not located only in our mind. Rather, the context of faith teaches us that this is who God is. And God's existence outside of our mind is itself greater than the definition as we hold it in our mind's eye. So he argues, quote, even the fool then is forced to agree that something than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind. It does. We have that definition of God in our mind. And Anselm continues, he understands this when he hears it. And therefore, what is understood, meaning what is grasped, what is known, is in the mind. He goes on, and surely that than which nothing greater can be thought cannot exist in the mind alone. For, he says, if it exists only in the mind, it can be thought to exist in reality also, which is greater. Now, those couple of sentences, if you were to just pick them up on any old day and not know the Platonic a priori arguments going on behind this, might not make a great deal of sense. But what Anselm is saying is, our very definition of God is that which is greater than all things. Nothing is greater than God. And therefore, he says, the fact that it is in my mind means that it can't simply be part of my mind. The very definition of who God is means God's definition, who he is not only located in my mind. Perhaps another way of looking at this is what Anselm is saying, within the context of faith, is that we don't have to kid ourselves into believing that we somehow made up God. From a Platonic argument, which is again where he's coming from, we can know that if we're believing that there is a God, and if we have received this from the context of faith, and if Psalm 52 tells us that the fool says there is no God, well, the very definition of who this God is can't simply be in our mind. It can't simply be a figment of our mind, he says. It has to exist in reality. Okay, is everyone convinced? Now, of course, not everyone will be convinced of this argument. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Not everyone shares the Platonic basis of where Anselm is coming from. And even if people have a modified Platonic view of how we come to knowledge, they will not always accept where Anselm takes this. Well, you're not alone if you feel that this is not the best argument, or if it's an inconclusive argument. Even in Anselm's own life, after he published the Proslogion, there was another monk, a man by the name of Guanilo, who actually issued a pretty scathing retort to this argument. In terms of the history of philosophy, this argument goes down as one of the most clever little digs at what someone believes is a bad argument. Guanilo argues that based on the concepts and the principles that Anselm is using, well then, why would we not then think of an island, that than which nothing greater can be thought of? And he called this the happy island or the blessed island. He says, there's something in my mind, an island, that than which nothing greater can be thought, the best island possible. Therefore, he argues, it has to exist. In terms of argumentation, this is what we call a reductio ad absurdum, which is just fancy jargon for you take someone's argument all the way to its logical or illogical conclusion, and then you read that conclusion back into the original premise. Guanilo argues, if that's your argument for God, I have an island timeshare for you, on an island that than which nothing greater can be thought. Now, Anselm isn't deterred by this. He actually finds it to be a helpful clarification. Anselm's response is, put simply, that God is of a different category than an island. Again, he's a Platonist in this sense. Describing an island in this way is illogical. God, rather, is the perfect being. He is the one who is outside of time and creation. So the description of him is of a different category, Anselm ends up arguing, than any description of an island or anything else. Now, some have seen in this that Anselm is special pleading. He's saying, well, this argument works for my argument, but any rejection of it because it sounds crazy in other spheres of life, well, those don't count. But again, Anselm, from the context of where he's coming from, arguing these a priori arguments, arguing these geometric arguments, as I've called them here, is, he believes, dealing with a different category. He's not dealing with anything in this world. Rather, from the context of this world, he is trying to say, how can I say that I know that God exists? I don't experience him. He is perfect and he is far away. And therefore, he says, Guanilo's criticism does not destroy his ontological proof for the existence of God. Now, I want to say one more thing about the Proslogion in terms of its application before we conclude. The ontological argument for Anselm is not unto itself the only thing he cares about. Rather, for him, the issue is how we then describe what we know about God, how we come to that knowledge of God. And what he does for the rest of the Proslogion is he has a sustained meditation on what we call the attributes of God. Now, all we mean by the attributes of God is simply the ways we describe God. Biblical language and other language. Is God good? Well, if you say yes, well, the goodness of God is one of his attributes. Is he all-powerful? Is he all-knowing? If you say yes to both of those things, congratulations, you're discussing the attributes of God. Well, one of the things that Anselm gives to theology, and it's something that you and I do pretty often if we're describing God, is he realizes that if we hold God up to an objective standard that is outside of himself, then we've actually placed something either over against God or above God. So using this sort of basic method, this Platonic ideal, in the ontological argument, as we call it today, Anselm begins to reflect on things like God's goodness and his justice and his omnipotence, etc. And where Anselm comes down on this is he realizes that at some point, a standard like goodness has to itself have a source. There has to be, to put it overly simply, a goodness greater than which nothing can be good, just as God is, by definition, that than which nothing greater can be thought. And where Anselm lands on this, and the arguments and the debate that he gives to the rest of the medieval world, is, on the one hand, he says, goodness is not some standard that God lives up to. Rather, God himself is goodness. He is the very source of goodness. All other standards of goodness are measured according to him. Same thing with justice. The definition of God is that he is a just and a merciful God. Therefore, proclaiming that God is being unjust or unmerciful is a contradiction of terms. God is justice. Therefore, we can't describe him as being unjust. And we say this all the time. God is goodness. He is good. We don't challenge that. The definition of God is the very source of goodness itself. So to say, is God ever evil, is by definition impossible. Almost the same as saying, is there a four-sided triangle? Well, in the end, Anselm applies the dialectic of faith seeking understanding, that he believes in order that he might know. And he comes up with one of the most interesting and the most provocative debates and descriptions for the very existence of God. But the only way to understand that, as we've said in this lecture, is to understand the man, his context, and his intellectual instincts. And though throughout the centuries, even until today, people have loved or hated the ontological argument, in the end, its legacy, in terms of shaping the way people talk about God, means that Anselm is one of the most important figures in the history of the Church.